Okay, so now we get to talk about one of the strangest pieces of literature out there, one that is unquestionably brilliant and full of genius ideas, but is also incredibly notable just for sort of its weirdness and the at times seemingly blasphemous things that it says, the claims that it's making, the way that it flips up and down and sort of forces us to consider a viewpoint that maybe we wouldn't consider. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by Blake was written, they say, roughly between around 1789, 1790. It was actually made by print. It wasn't something that he hand wrote or anything like that, and it never, had mass production, because it was printed by etching things into a metal form. And then etching them in backwards using acid and then making prints. So definitely, quite the feat to actually write all of this backwards. There are a lot of other things that are interesting about Blake and a lot of things that are, strange about him. Sort of, he wasn't really appreciated in his lifetime. It wasn't until years and years later that he was sort of respected for who, and the genius that he was. Marriage of Heaven and Hell is one of his earlier works. He went on to create much longer works that have complete mythologies, sort of, in a sense, to use sort of a mediocre but apt comparison. Sort of some of his later work has such an expansive mythology to it. It's almost sort of like Lord of the Rings or something like that. So there's a lot of interesting things going on with him. Just to give you an idea, in the copies, some of them out there, they sold, like one of them, copy D, which was printed in 1795. It was at one point sold in 1882 for roughly $50, 50 pounds at the time, which of course is worth more money now. But just to give you an idea of, sort of how it took a while for people to catch up with him, it's definitely a thing to consider. So the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, this is a, singular work. It's unlike anything else. It has poetry in it, it has prose in it, it has, lists of aphorisms in it, it has, conversations with the devil, it has conversations with prophet, it has, conversations regarding the nature of revolution and the body and the soul. All this stuff is in it. And here, what we're going to do is sort of slowly but surely kind of try to, work our way through some of its challenging ideas. This is the type of work where, we aren't always necessarily going to be able to unpack what he means all the time. The argument at the very beginning is an example of this. He says, Rintrah roars and shakes his fires in the burden air, hungry clouds swag on the deep. That even in this section here, it's sort of like, okay, well, who's Rintrah? So he's said to represent revolutionary wrath, and that this sort of argument is the idea that, maybe something is coming. Okay, maybe there is sort of doom on the way. As the work moves on, you'll notice he's, consistently referring to the Bible in spots. He says, now is the dominion of Edom and the return of Adam into paradise. See Isaiah, so that's where, Zion falls and all of that. But then we sort of get into one of the initial sort of big claims that Blake makes in this work. He says, without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. So what he's sort of saying here is that a lot of times we get the idea to think that, like, good is good and evil is bad, right? These things are, that one thing is the positive side of the equation and something else is the negative side of the equation. Blake says that this is totally wrong, which is interesting, also because many other, religious figures, especially in Eastern religion, definitely sort of hold that viewpoint. He sort of is making the argument that something like love and hate, which we see as being opposites, with one of them being positive and the other being negative, is that in a sense they're not really any different than up and down, right? Like, you need to have down to have up, you need to have hate to have love, and that because of this, that makes essential the thing that would seem to be negative and thus validates it. He says, from these contraries spring what the religious call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active springing from energy. Good is heaven. Evil is hell. Okay, this is the beginning of where Blake really starts to create some truly complex ideas. Right here, towards the very beginning, is that basically he's making relations between things. Okay, so you remember that Romanticism is sort of a response to the Enlightenment. Okay, during the Enlightenment, it was all about reason, rationality. That's the king of everything. Okay, Blake, as a romantic, is sort of, one of the earliest romantics before that was even an idea of a thing, is sort of calling that into question. He's saying that good is passive, good is reason, good is heaven. So reason, passivity, heaven, and good, all four of these things are basically equivalent in Blake's system. Okay, on the other side, you have evil, active, energy, and hell. Okay, and that basically these four things are more or less, not interchangeable, but synonymous. They're teammates in this sort of situation. And his argument is that, if we could see like passivity as being a bad thing and we can see action as a good thing, then that means we must also see evil and hell as being a positive thing, and see something that's called good or something that's called reason, or something that's called heaven as something that's problematic, that it's weak, that it doesn't necessarily have all there is to it. So you can see, even in that little bit, we're already dealing with some really hairy terrain. And maybe for Blake's case, it was a good thing that his work was not, being spread out to the masses, because these are the types of ideas that would have gotten somebody in a lot of trouble. Okay, then we move on to the next spot on plate 4. It's called The Voice of the Devil. Okay, so already here, where he does this thing throughout this work that's really interesting, where he'll say things, but you'll consider them and you'll be like, oh, that's an interesting idea, but then you remember that they were being said by the devil all along, which makes you wonder whether you can trust them, whether they are viable and valid in their own right, and you just sort of have to consider and debate that. This spot here on plate 4 raises some really huge issues. It says, all Bibles or sacred codes have been the causes of the following errors: that man has two real existing principles, a body and a soul; that energy called evil is alone from the body, and that reason called good is alone from the soul; that that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. So the narrator at this spot, the devil, okay, is making this argument and says the Bible has made this error, separating the body and the soul. The devil's making the argument that the body and the soul are one, okay, and that energy is evil and is something separate from the body, and that reason, called good, is alone from the soul. He's saying that no, that's not true. All this stuff is more sort of wrapped up. And he also says another error is that God will torment man forever following his energies, for following his evil impulses, for following his desires. So it's being said that all Bibles or sacred codes are sort of full of these types of errors: the separation of body and soul, the idea that people will be punished for sinning, in a sense, sin being following your energies. Okay, so interesting ideas, right? Because these are being put forth as an error. Of course, when these things are being said, they are in the voice of the devil, but you have to kind of wonder, is there legitimacy to this idea? And then it says, but the following contraries to these are true. Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of soul discerned by the 5 senses. Energy is the only life, and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. Energy is eternal delight. Okay, so remember, we got these connections, right? Evil, active, energy, and hell. These things, you can all sort of look at them the same way. So if it's saying energy is eternal delight, it might as well be saying hell is eternal delight. And this, of course, coming from the devil, is really interesting. And you can see here by plate 4, that Blake is really like throwing out a lot of incredibly complicated ideas regarding the nature of the body and the soul, the nature of desire, the nature of evil, and the idea that evil and sin and following your energies, as it were, might actually be a good thing. It goes on even, starting on plate 5, to say, those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. This is a really interesting idea, and one thing you need to remember is that this, when it was written, it was a time of great repression. In a lot of ways, this work as a whole is a response to conventional morality. Okay, the idea that you are to behave in a certain way. And it says, those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. If your desire were really worth anything, then it would be able to sort of lash out and do what it wanted. He goes on to discuss a little bit the relationship between Job and Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, and the Bible. We don't need to get into too much detail about that because it gets pretty complicated, but basically one of the big arguments that's sort of complex is the idea that according to a devil, in that a devil's account would say that at the point in which Satan was cast down, that in fact that was the Messiah, and what is hell is in fact heaven. So they're making that sort of argument. It says at the end of at the end of that little section, it says, note, the reason Milton felt in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. This is just an example of Blake being, hilarious, but also being quite honest in a sense, because in regards to Paradise Lost, it's this great long work discussing, the fall of, Satan down into hell, all the devils in pandemonium in hell, getting together, deciding what to do, deciding that they were going to go and try to corrupt God's creation, earth, thus meaning that, the devil went to the Garden of Eden, disguised himself as a snake, seduced Eve, yada, 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 the fall of man, all of this sort of stuff. One thing that's interesting about Paradise Lost is that when Milton is talking about heaven and angels, the writing is relatively restrained, but when he's talking about the devil, it's all very exciting. There's something fantastic about wickedness, and Milton sort of seemed to sense that, and Blake senses that both here in his work. We've seen this type of thing in Dante as well. It's something that's been tracked through history, is that ill behavior gets attention, good behavior does not. All you have to do is watch the news to see that. So he's saying that Milton was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it, that basically to be a true poet, you must be part of this group that follows his or her energies. It goes on and says, as I was walking among the fires of hell, delighted with the enjoyments of genius, which to angels look like torment and insanity, I collected some of their proverbs. I think that's another just hilarious thing. So it's like we get this memorable fancy. The narrator is who now is presumably a human being, not the voice of the devil anymore, is walking among the fires of hell, delighted with the enjoyments of genius, these things looking, this sort of evil, wicked sinfulness looking like torment and insanity to angels is in fact quite pleasurable. And it gets to this idea that basically, in this model, reason and angels and heaven, that is repression. That is something that's, where it's kept down, it's held down, and it's not able to really express itself. Then Blake goes on to his Proverbs of Hell. Okay, this is the most famous part of the marriage of heaven and hell, and with some good reason. It's just this list of proverbs, and there are quite a few of them, going through this whole entire giant list of various little, proverbs, aphorisms, little wisdom tidbits. Now, one thing that's really interesting about these wisdom tidbits is that they oftentimes seem really wise. Okay, they seem very smart. They seem like really astute. It's like, wow, Blake, what a great idea. That really is a truism. That's the kind of proverb that we can stand by. That's the type of thing that we can believe. But then, of course, we must contend with the idea that these are proverbs of hell and deal with our personal baggage, especially as a Christian, in that context, about whether we should be observing these things or not. But many of them are wise, and given the conceit of this work in and of itself, we sort of need to consider them at face value and think about them, and maybe go along on the ride with Blake as he's questioning these things. For example, some of them seem, very, very, fantastically true. A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees. That's very true. It's like if you're a moron and you look at a tree, you just see a tree. If you're a wise man, you look at a tree and you see, you see eternity, you see God, you see forever, you see natural law, you see all these things, right? So you get something like that as a proverb of hell, and it's very, very true and wise. Other ones that are very wise are, the cut worm forgives the plow, like the idea of forgiving something that's happened. There's the most sublime act is to set another before you. That's very, very pure and wonderful. But if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. But then there are some others that are a little bit different. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Okay, that basically by being a glutton, by like indulging in all your sins, that you will become wise through that. Those things are kind of more problematic, right? So there are lots of ideas in here. Some other that are really interesting. One of the most controversial ones is prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. That, religion as it was constituted in the late 18th century being a very repressive thing. We must always remember that the church was a much different thing back then than it is today. So, that basically like the repression caused by this organization is the type of thing that builds brothels. Some other things interesting: excess of sorrow laughs, excess of joy weeps. One thought fills immensity. The fox provides for himself, but God provides for the crow. That's a really interesting one. You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough. Here's one of my favorite ones. Listen to the fool's reproach. It is a kingly title. Is that basically if somebody who's not smart or somebody who's not valid is talking poorly on you or like judging you or giving you a hard time, that basically like you should uphold that judgment because it's a kingly title. It's like the best thing you can be called. So if some fool, says something bad to you, or says that you're a fool, you should lift that up and be grateful that you've been judged in such a way. To create a little flower is the labor of ages. Very beautiful, very beautiful. Well, really well done piece of work there. Some others that are, interesting. One that's another very sort of tough one. Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. Man, that's a lot to deal with. That's a lot to unpack. But in this idea that if you're sitting there nursing unacted desires, you're like, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this, and you're just like weeping and moaning about this thing that you want to do, and you're sort of feeling pity for yourself, that basically like that's a horrible thing to do. Exuberance is beauty. Okay, that's really lovely. So you get all these proverbs, and they come in all sorts of different flavors. Some of them make perfect sense, and seem really like honest and beautiful and moral. Other ones seem to be sort of more questionable, more sort of an embrace of sin. And you, as a reader and a conscientious person, just need to go through and sort of sort them out and think on them yourself. But some of them, are truly beautiful. To create a little flower is the labor of ages. That's beautiful, the idea that to create a little flower, it's something that's taken all of this time and that it should be appreciated because of that. So there's a lot of good stuff there. Then, moving forward a little bit as we wrap up this first video, we've got some things that are talking about the ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by names and adorning them with the properties of woods. So he's basically talking about the idea of ancient pantheism, the idea that there were gods and all sorts of things, till a system was formed which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. So the sort of separation that we get here is something that's a really fascinating piece. It's really something to consider a lot in debate. Also there, this section ends with this idea that thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. Okay, thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. Okay, so that basically we have gone awry and we have forgotten that in a sense God was and is within us all the time.